Barbara Dreyer. Barbara Jean Dreyer grew up alongside her sister, Gwendolyn, and their two brothers on Kenilworth Avenue in the Parkside neighborhood of Northeast Washington, D.C. Raised primarily by their grandparents due to estrangement from their parents, the siblings shared a close-knit upbringing. Gwendolyn fondly recalled their childhood, describing it as a unique part of D.C. where some residents even kept chickens. It was sort of like the country part of D.C., she reminisced. It was fun. Barbara and Gwendolyn, close in age, formed a deep bond that carried into adulthood. That connection was why Gwendolyn was among the first in the family to sense that something was terribly wrong when Barbara vanished in the summer of 1984. On the evening of August 12, 1984, at around 5 p.m., Barbara dropped off her two young sons, ages 6 and 9, at her adult daughter's home. She assured her daughter that she would be back soon, explaining that she was just heading out to pick up some cash. But Barbara, just 39 years old at the time, never returned. At first, Barbara's family wasn't overly alarmed by her absence. In the months leading up to her disappearance, she had been meeting her estranged husband somewhat regularly, occasionally staying out for days at a time without contacting family. It wasn't until 9 days after she was last heard from that concern truly set in. Barbara's 23-year-old son, Anthony Blaylock, reached out to her husband, asking if he had seen her. The husband, whose name has never been publicly disclosed but was known to be living in Hillcrest Heights at the time, told Anthony that he had not seen Barbara in quite some time. This unsettling response prompted Anthony to contact the police and officially report his mother missing. In the years since, Barbara's family has openly criticized law enforcement's handling of the case. They believe investigators did not take her disappearance seriously, dismissing it under the assumption that she may have been caught up in the widespread drug crisis that gripped Washington, D.C. at the time. This apparent indifference persisted as the investigation unfolded. A few days after Barbara vanished, Anthony made a startling discovery. He spotted his mother's car, a burgundy 1980 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme, being driven by an unfamiliar man. Alarmed, he decided to follow the vehicle as it made its way to an apartment complex in southwest D.C. After watching the driver park and exit the car, Anthony quickly rushed to a nearby friend's house to call the police. When authorities arrived, Anthony identified the man he had seen behind the wheel. However, in a bizarre twist, the man, whose name has never been publicly released, denied ever having driven Barbara's car and claimed not to know her at all. Since Barbara's vehicle had not been reported stolen, authorities did not detain the man driving it. However, they did impound the car, and when they searched the interior, they uncovered disturbing items: a ski mask, a length of rope, and a pair of gloves, along with several of Barbara's personal belongings. More alarmingly, investigators later discovered that the man found in possession of Barbara's car had a violent criminal history. At just 18 years old, he had pleaded guilty to the murders of two individuals, a 23-year-old man and a 16-year-old girl. The young girl had suffered a horrific fate, gang-raped by 3 men before she was ultimately stabbed to death. Both victims were murdered by a group of 4 men, and while the driver of Barbara's car had been directly involved, he received a relatively short prison sentence in exchange for cooperating with prosecutors. Adding to the chilling details, records show that just a year after Barbara disappeared, this same man was charged with abducting and raping another woman. However, the charges were inexplicably dismissed, and it remains unclear why. Another peculiar connection emerged during the investigation. Barbara had worked for over 15 years as a secretary for the Washington public school system. Coincidentally, the man last seen driving her car was also employed in the public school system, working as a maintenance man. This unsettling link, along with the other disturbing revelations, only deepen the mystery surrounding Barbara's disappearance. Online speculators have wondered if the two crossed paths while working. Unfortunately, that's where the investigation into Barbara's disappearance ends. She has never been seen or heard from since she went missing, and her case has remained cold for several decades. In the years since she vanished, the police have lost several important pieces of information, including her original missing persons reports, the ski mask, and the length of rope. Barbara's family have noted that they have likely lost vital forensic evidence as a result. A police spokesman confirmed the loss of the items, but offered no explanation as to what happened to the evidence, or why it was disposed of if that was the case. In February 2007, James L. Trainum, a 17-year veteran of the DC Police Homicide Squad, spent hours trying to locate the original file and desperately searched for the physical evidence, but found neither the rope nor the ski mask. It was here that it came to light that so much of the crucial evidence has been lost. Of the man who was driving Barbara's car, Trainum said, quote, "I don't think they should have let him go so easily, especially with his records. Nobody connected the dots. Nobody said, here's a guy with the missing woman's car. Let's check out his background." It would be doing the bare minimum. Additionally, the family lost multiple of Barbara's belongings as during the initial investigation, authorities took her diary, letters and photos that were later purged by the department who were attempting to make space for other cases. Gwendolyn, who worked as an emergency services dispatcher at the time, said the detectives she worked with were not doing what they were supposed to be doing and, quote, "Every time I would see them and tell them something, they would not check it out." Understandably, she soon found herself losing faith in her colleagues. In February 2009, Barbara's image and story were included on packs of playing cards that were distributed to inmates. However, this led to no new breakthroughs in the case. A year later, a $25,000 reward was offered for anyone with information leading to an arrest and conviction in Barbara's case. But again, the case remained at a standstill. Then in the spring of 2018, a construction crew found the skeletal remains of a woman stuffed into an apartment building's crawl space in the southeast of the city. Further searches of the area turned up 2 more bodies which were buried in shallow graves beneath the building. 2 of the women had been shot while 1 had been beaten to death. All 3 were found just less than 1 mile from the apartment complex where Anthony tracked his mother's car. For a short time, investigators thought that one of these bodies belonged to Barbara and conducted DNA testing to prove it. However, the results were negative. In August year, the women were identified as 48-year-old Jewel King, 41-year-old Virgil Jefferson, and 43-year-old Dorothy Jean Butts. All 3 women had gone missing in February 2006, and their murders are still being investigated. After Barbara's disappearance, her children were raised by her sister Gwendolyn, although 2 of her sons are now deceased. Anthony, who works for the federal government, continues to search for answers in his mother's case alongside his aunt. Barbara was 39 years old when she disappeared from Washington, D.C. She was last seen around 5 p.m. on August 12, 1984, after dropping off 2 of her children at her adult daughter's home. She assured her daughter she would return soon but never did. Her vehicle, a burgundy 1980 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme, was later found by her son outside an apartment complex. However, despite the suspicious circumstances, the driver was never detained, nor was he thoroughly investigated. Barbara is a black woman with black hair, brown eyes, and pierced ears. She stands at 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed approximately 130 pounds at the time of her disappearance. When last seen, she was wearing a green shirt with white trousers. If she is still alive today, she would be 76 years old. Bobby Jostinet. Despite his quiet and seemingly uneventful life, Branson Perry's disappearance would become one of Skidmore's most perplexing mysteries. On April 11, 2001, Branson was at home with a friend, cleaning up the house in preparation for his father's return from the hospital. At some point in the afternoon, Branson told his friend that he was going to take some jumper cables to a shed outside. He left the house and was never seen again. When his father returned 2 days later, Branson was nowhere to be found. His car, wallet, and personal belongings were left untouched, but there was no sign of him. At first, friends and family assumed he had gone off on his own, but as days turned into weeks, concern grew. A missing persons report was officially filed, and a search for Branson began. Over the years, various theories have emerged, some suggesting he was the victim of foul play, while others speculate he may have left voluntarily. The case remains unsolved, leaving his loved ones with more questions than answers. Jenna didn't think much of the 2 men at the time, as Branson seemed comfortable with them. He mentioned that he was going to take the jumper cables to a shed outside, a seemingly routine task. but after stepping out of the house, he never returned. Jenna left a short while later, assuming Branson had simply gotten distracted or left to run an errand. It wasn't until days later that his absence raised alarm. When Bob Perry returned home from the hospital, he found the house seemingly untouched. Branson's car was still there. His wallet and belongings remained, but his son was nowhere to be found. As the search for Branson intensified, strange details began to surface. The two men who had been working on Bob's car were identified, but neither provided any useful information regarding Branson's disappearance. What's even stranger is that weeks later, the jumper cables Branson had gone to put away were mysteriously returned to the shed. Despite numerous searches and investigations, Branson Perry's fate remains unknown. Some believe his assault just days before played a crucial role in his vanishing, while others suspect he may have been lured away by someone he trusted. To this day, his case remains open, leaving his family and the town of Skidmore desperate for answers. The circumstances surrounding Branson's last known actions remain unclear. According to most accounts, the 20-year-old told Jenna around 3 p.m. that he was going outside to put a pair of jumper cables in a shed near the house. But he never came back. His mother, Rebecca Kleinman, shared on the blog Bring Branson Home that Jenna saw him rush into the kitchen, grab something from a cabinet, and quickly head out the back door. When he returned, he refused to say what he had been doing and acted as if nothing unusual had happened. Not long after, Jenna went to take a shower. When she returned to the kitchen, she saw one of the men who had been working on Bob's car going through the drawers and cabinets. When she asked what he was looking for, he simply replied, "Nothing," before heading back outside. The two men were later questioned by police, but they were never officially considered suspects. They reportedly told investigators they never saw Branson after he went to the shed, despite the fact that he would have had to pass by them. The following day, Branson's grandmother, Joan Stinnett, stopped by the house and found the door unlocked. Even more unsettling was the fact that the house was empty. Concerned, Joan left, but later that night decided to call the residence, thinking Branson might have just been out for the day. However, the phone rang endlessly with no answer. She waited a few days before reaching out to Rebecca, who also hadn't heard from the 20-year-old in several days. Finally, when Bob was discharged from the hospital on April 17th, Branson was officially reported missing. Realizing that nearly a week had passed since Branson was last seen, authorities wasted no time launching an investigation. Ground search teams were quickly assembled, covering a 15-mile radius around his home on West Oak Street. Volunteers joined the effort, thoroughly searching fields, farms, ponds, rivers, wells, and abandoned buildings. Despite their exhaustive efforts, no trace of Branson was found. A search of the home he shared with Bob also revealed that the jumper cables he had set out to return to the shed that day were nowhere to be found. 2 weeks later, however, the jumper cables mysteriously reappeared just inside the shed door. No explanation has ever been found for their sudden return, leaving it as just one of many baffling details in Branson's case that continued to puzzle amateur sleuths. Within the first 2 months of the investigation, authorities had conducted over 100 interviews. During her questioning, Jenna Crawford disclosed that Branson had been experimenting with marijuana and amphetamines in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. She also admitted that she left his house without informing anyone that Branson was gone, assuming he had simply stepped out and forgotten to mention it. At the time, she saw no reason to suspect anything sinister. In addition to Jenna's statements, an unidentified family member came forward and informed detectives that Branson had a bottle of Valium with him on the day he vanished. Investigators decided to take a closer look at his drug use, questioning acquaintances he had connected with through his experimentation. However, none of them had seen him and they all passed polygraph tests. Authorities also explored potential ties between Branson and the local drug trade, uncovering rumors that he owed money to dealers, but this lead ultimately led nowhere. For several years, Branson's case grew cold. Then on April 10, 2003, Jack Wayne Rogers was arrested on multiple charges, including child pornography, first-degree assault, practicing medicine without a license, and obscenity charges. The charge for practicing medicine without a license came when Rogers attempted to remove a trans woman's genitals and a makeshift reassignment surgery at a hotel in Columbia, Missouri. During the procedure, the victim had to call emergency services because complications arose. Rogers was a known man to the community, being a 59-year-old Presbyterian minister and a Boy Scout leader who had been found to own an extensive collection of child pornography. He was also an active member of online messaging boards, where he described the graphic torture and assault of several different men, as well as claiming to have cannibalized the genitals of the men that he had castrated. He posted under usernames such as Extreme Body Mods and Oh Hail Satan. Among the many crimes he described on the forums was a first-hand account of him picking up a blonde male hitchhiker who he subsequently raped, tortured, mutilated, and murdered. He claimed to have buried the body in a remote area of the Ozark Mountains in Missouri. Notably, Branson's father, Bob, had suggested initially that his son had gone to stay with some of his friends in Kansas City. He thought that his son was embarrassed and struggling with the encounter with Jason Bierman, and theorized that he may have hitchhiked since he didn't have a car at the time. When news of Rogers' existence reached Branson's family, there was some hope that the police had found the man responsible for the 20-year-old's disappearance. When questioned, however, Rogers denied knowing or seeing Branson, claiming that the post he'd written about torturing a young blonde hitchhiker was just a fantasy that he'd made up and not based on true events. Yet when the investigators searched the 59-year-old's home, they found a turtle claw necklace in his vehicle, which closely resembled a necklace which Branson owned. Although Rogers' garden was also searched, nothing of note was discovered. In April 2004, Rogers was sentenced to 17 years for assault, 7 years for illegal surgery, and 30 years for child pornography charges. He was set to serve his sentences consecutively. At his sentencing, Rebecca Clenow pleaded with Rogers and asked him to reveal the location of Branson's body, but Rogers continued to maintain his innocence. After their encounter, Rebecca began to believe that perhaps the former Boy Scout leader wasn't involved in her son's disappearance after all. She speculated that someone local to the area was involved instead. 5 years later, in June 2009, investigators revealed that they were excavating a site in Quitman, Missouri after receiving a credible tip that the area was Branson's resting place. A 2-day search was executed with the excavation site consisting of a 23-foot hole that covered a 20 by 40-foot area. A local farmer residing about 1.5 miles east of Quitman told reporters that authorities had searched for an abandoned well on his property, but nothing had been found. Similarly, nothing was found on the Quitman site. Unfortunately, updates in Branson's case are far and few between from this point onwards. In February 2010, Rebecca offered a $20,000 reward for information leading to her son's whereabouts, while America's Most Wanted featured the case on their show. Though this renewed interest in the case, no substantial leads came forward. More recently, however, a New Jersey police officer named Michael Kurz, who had researched the case for 18 years in his free time, and the Nottoway County Sheriff's Office have revealed that they believe the case to be drug-related, though they have not elaborated much further on these statements. Furthermore, in February 2022, Branson's aunt, Gail McMurray, told News Press Now that she knew little of his drug use, but said that he admitted to her that he was using them and wished to stop. He was reportedly set to attend rehab just days after he went missing. Both Michael Kurz and the Nottoway County Sheriff's Office have also stated that though they have a strong suspect in the case, they do not have enough evidence to make an arrest and to press charges. Nottoway County Captain Austin Hahn told News Press Now, quote, "You want to make sure you have as much evidence as you can to get probable cause to make that arrest and to send a good, solid, fully investigated case up to the courts to hopefully get a conviction on that and get some justice in that case." End quote. He added that a body would likely need to be recovered before an arrest could be made, with Michael Kurz noting, quote, "It's difficult to make an arrest for a situation like a homicide without a body or without Branson's remains." End quote. Branson's aunt, Gail, also added, quote, "People don't want to come forward. Their lives are going to be in danger if they know who did it. Someone knows something. I promised his dad and grandparents that I would never give up on finding Branson." End quote. Tragedy has struck Branson's family on multiple occasions. In February 2004, 3 years after he went missing, Branson's 23-year-old heavily pregnant cousin, Bobby Jo Stinnett, was found murdered. Her killer had removed her baby from her body though, and thankfully, the child was later recovered unharmed. The murderer was found, arrested, and convicted. Later that same year, Bob Perry passed away. He never found closure or justice. Then, in February 2011, Rebecca Clenow died after a lengthy battle with melanoma. She was buried next to an empty plot which she'd saved for her son. Branson's empty plot has a headstone where his date of death is listed as April 11, 2001. And finally, aged 80, Joan Stinnett, Branson's grandmother, died in February 2015. Branson's extended family, including his cousins, aunts, and uncles, continue their search for answers, as do law enforcement officials, who have emphasized that the case remains open despite the passing of Branson's parents. The 20-year-old was last seen on April 11, 2001, at his home in Skidmore, Missouri. He is described as a white male, standing between 5 feet 9 inches and 5 feet 10 inches tall, with blonde hair and blue eyes. At the time of his disappearance, he weighed between 140 and 155 pounds with a lean yet strong build. Branson also has a faint scar on his upper right cheek, a small scar on his left knee, and a medical condition known as tachycardia. When last seen, he was wearing size 32 shorts, a medium to large size t-shirt, and necklaces adorned with arrowhead pendants. If he is still alive today, Branson would be 43 years old. Anyone with information regarding his disappearance is encouraged to contact the Nottoway County Sheriff's Office at 660-582-7451. Moving on to the next case. Adrienne Shelly. Adrienne Shelly was recognized for her work as an off-Broadway actress and for starring in independent films such as Trust, 1990, and The Unbelievable Truth, 1989. In the years that followed, she took on minor roles in various television shows, including Law and Order and Oz, while also securing significant roles in off-Broadway productions. Her final project before her passing was the comedy-drama film Waitress, which she wrote, directed, and starred in. The film received critical acclaim and, along with its cast, won 5 film awards in addition to earning multiple nominations. In 2015, Waitress was adapted into a Broadway musical, receiving a Tony Award nomination. Tragically, Adrienne never witnessed the success of her work, as she was murdered in November 2006 before the film's release in February 2007. She was found deceased on November 1, 2006, at approximately 5:45 p.m. in the Manhattan apartment she used as an office in Abingdon Square. Her husband, Andy Ostroy, discovered her body after growing concerned when she remained unreachable throughout the day. He had dropped her off at 9:30 that morning, and it was unusual for her to be out of contact for so long, particularly as she was anticipating important news about whether Waitress would be accepted into the Sundance Film Festival. Andy discovered Adrienne hanging from the shower rod in the bathroom, with a bedsheet wrapped around her neck. The post-mortem examination determined that her cause of death was neck compression, and that she had been deceased for 5 to 6 hours before being found. Initially, investigators believed the 40-year-old had taken her own life. However, Andy was not convinced. Adrienne had no history of depression or mental health struggles, and she had been enthusiastic about her film project. Moreover, she was a devoted mother to her 2-year-old daughter, making the idea of suicide seem implausible to those who knew her. Andy struggled to understand the investigators' conclusions, especially after noticing several suspicious details. Money was missing from Adrienne's purse, an unidentified shoe print was found on the toilet lid, and the door had been left unlocked. Unwavering in his belief that his wife did not take her own life, he publicly rejected the police's assessment. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now let's move on with the video. Determined to uncover the truth, he pressured investigators to re-examine the crime scene and consider the evidence he had pointed out, hoping they would recognize the inconsistencies in their theory. Speaking to the media, he emphasized the importance of justice, stating that his daughter deserved to grow up knowing the truth about what really happened to her mother. investigators soon realized that Andy's suspicions were valid. They discovered that the shoe prints at the scene matched a man's size 8 Reebok Allen Iverson-style trainer. Footwear that did not belong to Adrian, Andy, or any of the medics who had responded. As detectives continued their investigation, they began interviewing people who knew Adrian and eventually learned about an aspiring writer who had been persistently trying to get her to read his screenplay. According to police reports, he appeared to be frustrated with Adrian, frequently seeking her attention despite her lack of interest. When law enforcement attempted to track this writer down, they discovered he had moved out and left the country. This raised immediate suspicions, but further investigation revealed that he had actually departed the U.S. before Adrian's death, eliminating him as a suspect. With no new leads and no viable suspects, authorities found themselves back at square one. On November 5th, for days after the murder, investigators decided to return to the crime scene for another review. They discovered that there was construction going on the floor directly above where Adrian's apartment was located and decided to check out the area. It was here in one empty apartment, its floor covered with construction paper, that the police found a dusty shoe prints that looked awfully familiar. Law enforcement turned to the foreman, Wilson Pilko. At his home, they noticed a backpack with a pair of trainers inside that looked like the Reeboks they were searching for. When asked about them, Wilson stated they belonged to his younger brother, 19-year-old Diego Pilko, who was a construction worker. The shoes were soon found to be a match to the prints found in Adrian's bathroom. When confronted by investigators, Pilko claimed that he'd been in the building, but he didn't know Adrian and hadn't been in her office. Then he changed his story. He alleged that Adrian had complained about the construction noise and he'd thrown a hammer in her direction. Worried she would complain and that he'd lose his job and home because he was in the U.S. illegally, he followed her back to her office. He claimed that Adrian hit him first, and then he had retaliated by punching her in the face and knocking her to the ground. She had subsequently hit her head on the way down and was knocked unconscious. Believing he had killed her, Pilko staged the hanging in the bathroom. However, investigators knew this story was incorrect because Adrian had not suffered a blow to their head, and her cause of death was neck compression. At his trial in February 2008, Pilko changed his story again. He stated that he chose to rob Adrian after noticing her during his lunch break. However, when she caught him in the act, he attempted to silence her by covering her mouth, causing her to lose consciousness. Afterward, he wrapped a bedsheet around her neck and strangled her. Pilko then dragged Adrian's body to the bathroom and staged the scene to resemble a suicide. Pilko later pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter and was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Since he was in the U.S. illegally, he will be deported to Ecuador upon completing his sentence. Moving on to the next case. Christa Helm. Christa Helm is probably not a name you're familiar with. As a struggling actress in Hollywood during the 1970s, her career mostly consisted of small roles in shows like Wonder Woman and Starsky and Hutch. However, despite her limited success on screen, Christa was well-connected, frequently attending high-profile parties and mingling with celebrities like Mick Jagger while contemplating her career move. On the night of February 11, 1977, 27-year-old Christa went to a party in the Laurel Canyon neighborhood of Los Angeles with her roommate, Stephanie. Later, Stephanie would recall that during the party, Christa approached her with a strange, dazed expression. When asked what was wrong, Christa brushed it off, saying it was nothing. However, Stephanie insisted she could tell something had unsettled her, saying, "Asterisk. I'll never forget that look. Asterisk." Stephanie left the party soon after, as she had plans to visit her boyfriend. Before leaving, she handed her car keys to Christa and went on her way. That would be the last time she saw her friend and roommate alive. Later that night, Stephanie tried calling their home from a payphone but got no answer. A deep sense of unease told her something was wrong. In the early hours of February 12th, Christa's body was discovered in West Hollywood. After leaving the party, she had gone to visit a friend, Sandy Smith, a music agent who had been invited but declined to attend, opting for an early night instead. Christa's body was found partially underneath a parked car that belonged to Sandy's girlfriend, Nancy. Although she lived with Sandy, Nancy was reportedly not home that evening. Homicide detective Larry Brandenburg, who responded to the crime scene, later described the setting in Oxygen's Mysteries and Scandals, saying, "Asterisk, it was an older but somewhat exclusive neighborhood. I think Krista might have known someone was chasing or following her because she stopped fast in her car. We know that she exited the car, had a heated conversation with someone, and before she was able to return to her car, she was attacked." He added that neighbors heard blood-curdling screams that sounded like a cat being skinned. Krista's death was horrifically violent. She bore 23 stab wounds to her front, back, neck, and on the side of her head. She also had defensive injuries to her hands. Immediately, authorities did not suspect that this was a random encounter. Given the level of violence and brutality inflicted on the 27-year-old, they believed she knew her killer. Furthermore, Krista's handbag was missing from the scene. This led to speculation that whoever had killed her had been after her now infamous diary, which she reportedly kept in her possession at all times. The diary is said to have contained the names of men and women she had sexual encounters with and allegedly included a rating system. Many of Krista's friends were aware of her diary, and some had even warned her against keeping it, fearing it could put her in danger. While some believed she planned to turn it into a book, others suspected she might use it to blackmail powerful figures in Hollywood. In a chilling turn, shortly before her death, she sent a postcard to a friend that read, "Asterisk, I am in way over my head here. I'm into something I can't get out of." Asterisk. A few months earlier, she had also written a letter to a friend, stating that she was involved in something serious and might have to disappear for a while. Initially, detectives explored a potential link between Krista's murder and that of actor Sal Mineo, who had been stabbed to death in 1976 at the age of 37. Disturbingly, his murder had occurred exactly 1 year before hers and in the same area, West Hollywood. At the time, investigators ruled out any connection, as they believed Mineo's killer was already in prison when Krista was killed. However, decades later, authorities realized that the real perpetrator, 21-year-old Leona Williams, had not been arrested until after Krista's murder. Some detectives continue to suspect that Williams may have been responsible for her death as well. Investigators struggled to make sense of Krista's personal life, and they failed to find solid leads. Without the notebook that kept track of all her relationships, they found it difficult to know where to start, especially as nobody wanted to discuss or admit to their relationship with the 27-year-old. Detectives also discovered that Krista had audio recorded many of her sexual encounters, but those tapes have also never been recovered. They were allegedly taken by another fledgling actor at the time, Tony Sirico, in the days following her death. Although Krista's roommates noticed the theft and informed the police, Sirico was never interviewed until years later, at which point he denied everything. Eventually, the case grew cold. It wasn't until February 2008 that it was reopened at the behest of Krista's only daughter, Nicole, who was just 9 when her mother died. During this fresh look at the case, one man did come to the attention of police. Rudy Mazzella was a partygoer who attended many of the same parties Krista did. He was a known drug dealer with a violent reputation too. Police found that back in 1977, a woman whose boyfriend was close to Mazzella had told detectives, quote, "My boyfriend told me that Rudy had told him that he had murdered Krista." She added that he did not provide a motive for the killing. Though Mazzella was questioned, he denied everything and the lead went nowhere. He died in the early 2000s before the case was reopened. Investigators still suspect that Krista's book and/or the audio tapes are the reason she wound up dead. Investigators have also considered the possibility that jealousy played a role in Krista's murder. Perhaps she had been involved with someone who was already in a relationship. Or maybe someone resented her lack of interest in exclusivity. One potential lead was Patty Collins, a backup singer who had been romantically involved with Krista. Notably, Patty left town the day after the murder, which raised suspicions. However, she later explained to the police that she had fled out of fear for her own life. She believed that Krista had been killed because of something she knew, and she worried that the murderer might assume Krista had shared that secret with her. In February 2008, forensic experts were able to extract a DNA profile from material found beneath Krista's fingernails at the time of her death. Interestingly, the profile belonged to a woman. Despite this breakthrough, no matches have been identified so far. Anyone with information regarding Krista's murder is encouraged to contact the Homicide Cold Case Unit at the LA County Sheriff's Department at 323-890-5500. Moving on to the next case. Christine Kupka. Christine Kupka was a dedicated honor student at Baruch College in New York, pursuing a degree in philosophy. To support herself, she worked as a server at a Jamaican restaurant in 1998 and shared a home with 5 roommates. During her time at the college, she became acquainted with Darshan and Prasad, an adjunct chemistry professor of Indo-Guyanese descent. After completing his class, the two began dating and were in a relationship for 5 months. Eventually, Darshan learned that Christine was 5 months pregnant. Desperate for her to terminate the pregnancy, he repeatedly urged her to have an abortion, but she refused. On October 24, 1998, Christine left her residence on Westminster Avenue in New York City around 12:30 p.m. and never returned. According to her roommate, Darshanand had arrived at their home shortly before she left. She recalled that he appeared anxious. Before leaving, Christine left a message on her sister's answering machine, stating that she was going with Darshanand to see his new apartment and would be back soon. However, she was never seen again. Her family later informed the police that her relationship with Darshanand had been troubled. They revealed that after he learned about the pregnancy, Christine grew fearful that he might harm her or the baby, though she never explicitly said he had threatened her. It was later discovered that Darshanand was married, a fact he reportedly only disclosed to Christine after she became pregnant. However, at the time the baby was conceived, he had not yet been married. Initially, he denied paternity, claiming he had undergone a partial vasectomy, but he later withdrew this statement. According to Christine's family and friends, Darshanand was both angry and afraid, expressing concerns that his family would disown him if they found out about the pregnancy. He feared being cast out by both his family and his community. Darshanand was a Guyanese immigrant, and his father served as a Hindu priest. Christine had reportedly spoken to Darshanand's wife on multiple occasions, having first contacted her while trying to reach him through his pager. During their conversations, Christine assured his wife that she had no intention of disrupting their family but wanted Darshanand to take responsibility for their child. Upon learning of Christine's pregnancy, his wife was said to have reacted with anger toward him. Christine planned to list Darshanand as the father on the baby's birth certificate and intended to seek financial support from him if necessary. After learning this, Darshanand distanced himself from her for some time, but eventually reappeared in her life shortly before she went missing. He claimed that his family had disowned him and that he was staying with a cousin. During this period, he seemingly embraced the pregnancy, suggesting baby names and even offering to be a birthing coach. However, after Christine's roommate reported her missing on October 25th, her family tracked down Darshanand's residence, only to discover that he was still living there and had never been thrown out as he had claimed. The family confronted him about Christine's whereabouts and the police were called in. Darshanand told the police that he had driven Christine to a shopping center and then waited in his car for her to return from shopping. After finishing her shopping, he said he dropped Christine off 2 blocks from her house between 3 o'clock and 4 p.m. as she wanted to walk to a nearby health food store. When Christine's family asked him which shopping mall he had taken her to, he said he did not know. Christine's family then questioned around the neighborhood. A laundromat owner came forward and said that he had seen her walking past the establishment, and the owner of the area health food store said she might have seen her at approximately 7 p.m. the day of her disappearance, but would later change her story and said the woman was not Christine since the woman wore peach-colored pants which Christine did not own. Authorities called in Darshanand, but he appeared before the detectives in the presence of his attorney and refused to answer any questions. The family hired an investigator, and he believes that Darshanand is involved in her disappearance. There is no actual evidence linking Darshanand to Christine's disappearance and probable murder. No witnesses, no confessions, no physical evidence. The circumstances surrounding Christine's disappearance remain unresolved. Authorities noted that while Darshanand was cooperative during his single interview, he did not have an alibi for the time she vanished. Despite this, he has never been charged in connection with the case and continues to assert his innocence. He now resides in Florida, works as a dentist, and remains married. In 2010, investigators began excavating the basement floor of a shop that had once belonged to one of Darshanan's relatives. A section of the concrete appeared different from the rest, and a cadaver dog signaled the possible presence of human remains. However, no evidence was ever discovered. To this day, Christine remains missing. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now let's move on with the video. Moving on to the next case. Iona Wake Sorik. Iona had recently graduated high school and was awaiting admission results while planning a vacation to Spain. On Friday, July 16th, she attended a party at a mutual friend's apartment before heading to a club in Saw Pot with her friend, Audria, and three Powell, Merrick, and Adrian. Initially, she had planned to remain at the first party, but she instead chose to accompany the three men she had only known for about a month. During their time at the club, an argument broke out between them, though the cause of the dispute remains unknown. According to her friends, Iona abruptly left in a hurry. CCTV footage captured her at approximately 3:45 a.m. outside Dream Club, walking barefoot with her high heels in hand. She went towards the seaside promenade. She has no money and her phone battery was running low. She waits until the dawn breaks at around 4 a.m. and starts walking in the direction of her home through the seaside boulevard. She had about 6 kilometers, 3.7 miles to go. She texted a few people on her way, also Audria, saying she's angry that her friend didn't follow her out. Edwana called Audria and Audria says that they settled the argument over the phone and that they were okay now. A few minutes later, after 4 a.m., she calls Audria for the last time, telling her that her phone battery is dying, telling her where she is and telling her that she's heading to Audria's home, was a bit drunk and probably didn't want to meet her mom like that, and Audria's parents were away, so her house was the perfect place to go. At that time, she said that she leave the keys outside for Edwana to come in. She was actually standing near Edwana's apartment at the time of the conversation, and Edwana's stepfather heard Audria talking. The stepfather also claimed that he had heard Edwana, but Audria says that's because she had the speakerphone on. This was the last time anyone heard from Edwana. Edwana was captured on CCTV walking down the seaside boulevard at 4:12 a.m. This would be the last known whereabouts of Edwana. Her mother thought she was at Audria's. Audria thought she had gone home because the keys were still intact. They realized that something was wrong around 5 a.m. on June 17th. In the surveillance footage at the beach, it is clear that a certain distance behind the girl, there is a man in a plaid shirt with a towel on his shoulder walking. To this day, the man has not been identified. Police, at the start, made very little attempt in locating Iwana. They initially thought that maybe she had gone off to party somewhere else, or stayed at some other friend's house, or had run off. The official investigation didn't begin until a week after Iona's disappearance. Despite extensive searches, none of her belongings or clothing from that night were ever recovered. Early in the investigation, around 100 individuals were questioned, but no significant leads emerged. Some theories suggest that the conversation Iona's stepfather overheard wasn't actually a phone call, but rather a face-to-face conversation. This has led to speculation that Audria and Iona met outside the apartment building and that Audria may have more information about what happened. Authorities released the composite sketch of an unidentified man seen on CCTV, but no one has come forward to identify him. The case remains unsolved. Moving on to the next case. Laura Hobbs. 2 girls rode their bikes to the park and vanished, setting off a chain of events that seemed almost impossible to believe. From the start, the story played out like a detective thriller with an astonishing plot. As the situation developed, it grew more perplexing until all the mysteries finally merged into a single answer. Laura Hobbs was born on September 25, 1996, in Texas. Later, her parents had 3 sons, but their relationship eventually ended in separation. Laura's mother moved with the children to the quiet town of Zion, Illinois. She quickly grew fond of the area, as her maternal grandparents lived there, and she soon formed new friendships. Additionally, Zion was located along the shores of Lake Michigan, a place she loved visiting with her family. In February, when Laura was 8 years old, her father chose to reunite with his wife and become part of the children's lives again. He moved from Texas to live with the family. A few months later, on Sunday, May 8th, they celebrated Mother's Day. Laura, her brothers, and their parents spent the day at the lake, enjoying the occasion and flying kites. They had a wonderful time, and later, Laura wanted to take a walk with her best friend, 9-year-old Crystal. The two girls attended the same school and lived nearby. When Laura moved to Zion, they quickly bonded and became inseparable, spending nearly all their free time together. They would visit each other's homes, play near their houses, and ride their bikes. Whenever Laura's mother didn't allow her to go out, Crystal would come to her window, and they would chat. That day, they decided to take their bikes and ride to the park, which was just a few hundred yards from their homes. The girls often visited the park since it was nearby and featured a long bike trail. Despite their young age, their parents felt comfortable letting them go, as both were familiar with the area, and serious crimes in the town were extremely rare. They left around 3 p.m., planning to return in time for dinner. However, as the hours passed, their parents began to grow concerned. By 7 p.m., when Laura and Crystal still hadn't come home, their families decided to head to the park to call them back. To their shock, the girls were nowhere to be found. They walked along the bike path calling their names, but there was no response. Soon, other family members joined in the search, growing more anxious with each passing moment. The search continued throughout the park and into the surrounding neighborhood streets, as family members desperately hoped to find the girls. Hours passed with no sign of them, and as darkness began to set in, concern turned to fear. By 9 p.m., the parents realized that something may have happened to Laura and Crystal, contacting them to contact the police. Law enforcement quickly joined the search efforts, enlisting the help of volunteer organizations, search dogs, and several dozen volunteers. As word spread about the missing girls, local residents also stepped in to assist. The police concentrated their search in the park, as that was where the girls had planned to go. Speaking with children who lived along the route from their homes to the park, officers confirmed that Laura and Crystal had passed by, stopping briefly to chat before continuing on their way. Meanwhile, investigators went door to door in the neighborhood, hoping someone had seen the girls that evening. They also began distributing flyers with details about their disappearance, determined to gather any possible leads. With each passing hour, the fear that something terrible had happened to the girls grew stronger. Night had fallen, and despite the town-wide search, there was no sign of Laura or Crystal. The search continued relentlessly, stretching into the early morning hours. By around 4:30 a.m., the police decided to pause briefly, but Laura's father and grandfather refused to stop. Determined to find the girls, they headed back to the park and decided to split up to cover more ground. At around 6 a.m., as the first light of dawn appeared, Laura's grandfather suddenly heard a cry and rushed toward the sound. He found Laura's father, who stood frozen in shock. He had discovered the bodies of Laura and Crystal. The girls lay hidden off the bike path, concealed by thick undergrowth. Laura's father immediately realized they were dead, as their bodies were covered in blood and showed severe injuries. Without hesitation, he called the police, who arrived swiftly to the scene. After examining the bodies, forensic experts concluded that the girls had died from multiple stab wounds, likely inflicted with a knife. Laura had suffered 20 such injuries, while Crystal had 11. The horrifying news sent shockwaves through the small town, where violent crimes were almost unheard of. Now, residents were confronted with the grim reality that an unknown attacker had brutally murdered 2 young girls just a few hundred meters from their homes. Determined to find the perpetrator, the police focused all their efforts on the investigation. Their initial suspicions fell on Laura's father, Jerry. Authorities found it suspicious that he had discovered the bodies alone, despite the park having already been searched by officers and volunteers. As they looked deeper into his past, they uncovered a troubling criminal history. Jerry had been involved in various offenses, ranging from drug-related charges in his youth to violent assaults. One particularly alarming incident had occurred in February 2001, which ultimately led to his wife taking the children and moving to another state. At the time, while they were still living in Texas, an argument between Jerry and his wife had spiraled out of control. The incident took place in front of their home when 3 passing men noticed the heated argument and stepped in, believing Jerry's wife was in danger. Enraged by their interference, Jerry ran to grab a chainsaw and began chasing them. The men eventually managed to subdue him and hold him down until the police arrived. As a result, Jerry was charged, and a year later he was sentenced to 10 years of probation. Part of the conditions required him to check in regularly with his probation officer, but he failed to attend one of these appointments. Because of this violation, his probation was revoked, and he was sentenced to 18 months in prison. He was released just a few weeks before the tragic deaths of his daughter and her friend and had traveled to Zion almost immediately after his release. To the police, his history of aggressive behavior made him a strong suspect. However, they lacked concrete evidence or a clear motive. Instead, they invited him in for questioning. Jerry agreed to go to the station, where investigators gradually began pressing him about his possible involvement. During more than 20 hours of questioning, Jerry initially denied any in the deaths of his daughter and her friend. He repeatedly insisted that he had nothing to do with it, claiming that after he and his wife realized Laura hadn't returned home, he went out searching for her. He said he continued looking until he eventually found the girls' bodies in the park. However, as the interrogation went on, his story began to change. Under relentless pressure from detectives, Jerry eventually started to confess. He claimed that on that evening, he had indeed gone to the park and seen Laura with Crystal. Angry that his daughter had gone out without permission, he scolded her and demanded that she come home with him. When Laura refused, he grabbed her arm in an attempt to take her back. She resisted, and Crystal intervened, insisting that he leave Laura alone. According to Jerry, Crystal then pulled out a small knife from her pocket and pointed it at him. Jerry flew in a rage. He seized the knife and repeatedly stabbed both girls before leaving their bodies in the overgrown section of the park and walking away. The following morning, he allegedly discovered the bodies and reported it to the police, hoping to divert suspicion away from himself. During his confession, Jerry was in tears, but he signed his admission statement and repeated it on camera. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community, leaving the girls' families devastated. No one could have imagined that Laura's own father was responsible for the horrific crime. However, his wife later told the police that she had always been aware of his violent tendencies, given his history of criminal offenses. Despite his confession, Jerry was arrested and held in prison as he awaited trial. Soon after, the prosecutor announced plans to seek the death penalty. However, as preparations for the trial dragged on, unexpected developments in the case began to emerge. Jerry was assigned a lawyer, and he abruptly changed his stance, now claiming he had nothing to do with the murders. He insisted that his confession had been coerced, given under immense pressure from detectives who had interrogated him for over 20 hours. He further alleged that the officers had threatened both him and his family, and had even subjected him to physical mistreatment. At the time, he had gone more than 2 days without sleep, and was in a deeply distressed state after discovering his daughter's body, struggling to cope with his grief. According to Jerry, the police told him that if he simply confessed to the murders, they would let him go and allow him to rest. He claimed that had essentially fed him the details of the crime, constructing a plausible scenario and pressuring him to repeat it. Once they had crafted a coherent narrative, they wrote it down for him to sign and instructed him to read it on camera. His attorney immediately requested a case review, but the request was quickly denied. The prosecution maintained that Jerry had confessed voluntarily and had reaffirmed his statement on video. Nevertheless, after retracting his confession, he had to go through a full-fledged trial with a jury, which prolonged his wait for several years. Following this, Jerry's lawyer discovered some significant details. Initially, he knew that there wasn't a single real piece of evidence against his client, and decided to focus on searching for any leads. Here, he found out that the medical examiners had not even thoroughly examined the bodies of the girls. They had conducted all the standard procedures like taking swabs, collecting debris from under the girl's fingernails, and so on. However, after storing these samples in the refrigerator, no one had considered analyzing their contents. The lawyer pushed to have all these pieces of evidence examined in an independent laboratory. The prosecution tried to obstruct his efforts, but he succeeded in February 2008. The examinations were finally conducted, and there was a rather unexpected twist. It turned out that Laura's body had several different DNA samples on it. There was foreign skin under her fingernails and male semen found on her clothes and in 3 places on her body. Simple analysis revealed that none of this belonged to Laura's father. It all pointed to a completely different man. This discovery unequivocally indicated that Laura had been sexually assaulted. As for Crystal, they did not find any foreign DNA on her body, but no one doubted that she was killed by the same person. Jerry's lawyer immediately requested his client's release from prison and a dismissal of all charges. However, district prosecutor refused to acknowledge the new evidence, claiming that it meant nothing. In his opinion, the presence of foreign DNA on Laura's body could have been entirely coincidental. He argued that young couples regularly visited that park for intimate encounters, and he believed that this was why male semen ended up on the girl's body, possibly from the grass or bushes. Even the fact that some biological samples were found inside the victim's body didn't seem to faze him. Despite the absurdity of this version, Jerry remained in prison, awaiting the start of his trial. Nevertheless, the lawyer managed to get the DNA sample entered into the FBI's database. But there were no matches. All he could do was wait and hope that the perpetrator would be caught sooner or later, because there was no hope for reasonableness from the prosecution's side in Jerry's case. Let's fast forward 4 years and miles away from Zion. A 20-year-old woman named Amanda Snell, who had recently joined the military, lived in the military base in Arlington, Virginia. She decided to enlist because there were many military members in her family. Alongside her service, she occasionally helped a local church near the base. There, she taught children with autism and other developmental differences. Amanda quickly realized that she wanted to pursue this professionally and planned to get the necessary education after her military service. On July 13, 2009, she didn't report for duty, immediately raising concerns among her fellow service members. They went to a room, knocked on the door, but received no response. They discovered that the door was unlocked and entered. The room was impeccably tidy. The bed was made, and her belongings were neatly in place. But Amanda was nowhere to be found. Only after they opened the closet did they come across a horrifying sight. Amanda's lifeless body lay in an unnatural position with a pillowcase over her head. Initially, the medical examiners couldn't determine the cause of death, but they later concluded that Amanda died of suffocation. Her death had occurred over a day before her body was discovered. There were no signs of trauma on Amanda's body, nor was there any evidence of sexual assault. The only notable detail investigators discovered was that her laptop and tablet were missing from her room. When speaking with Amanda's parents, detectives learned an interesting fact. She suffered from severe headaches, and when the pain became unbearable, she would sometimes retreat to a dark room and cover her head with a pillowcase. Given that Amanda was found in her closet with a pillowcase over her head, investigators considered the possibility that her death had been a tragic accident. However, they didn't rule out the possibility of murder. Near the entrance of her closet, they found a men's shoe print, but they were unable to determine who it belonged to. With no definitive answers, investigation remained open as detectives continued searching for a potential suspect. Then, in February 2010, a 26-year-old woman from Arlington exited a metro station and began walking toward her boyfriend's home. As she made her way down the street, a stranger suddenly approached her, brandished her gun, and ordered her to get into his car. Despite the assailant grabbing her arm and brandishing a knife, the woman managed to break free. She threw her purse as a distraction and fled toward her boyfriend's house. Upon hearing her cries, he and his friends rushed onto the street and called the police. By the time they did, the assailant had already fled. Nevertheless, the woman could provide a detailed description of his appearance. She also remembered the model of his car, a beige Dodge Durango. Based on the victim's description, a composite sketch of the suspect was created, and the police began their search. 2 weeks later, on February 27th, two women from Arlington were returning home after spending the evening with France. When they stood at their doorstep, an unknown man approached from behind, brandishing a gun, and demanded their wallets. After the women informed him they had no money, the assailant forced them inside the house and bound their hands. At one point he left the room, and one of the women managed to free her hands. She grabbed a phone and dialed 911. However, the man swiftly returned, snatched the phone, and smashed it against the wall. Subsequently, he grabbed one of the women, took her out to his car, and drove away. After covering some distance, he raped her, taped her head with duct tape, and strangled her with a scarf until she lost consciousness. She later regained consciousness in the snow by the side of the road when passers-by found her. She was taken to the hospital, where the police promptly arrived. The woman provided them with a description of the attacker and mentioned the model of his car, a beige Dodge Durango. Remarkably, just 2 hours before this attack, another woman had reported to the police. She told them that a man matching the same description and driving the same type of car had approached her on the street. He had attempted to coerce her into his vehicle, but she had used her stun gun on him and managed to escape. Investigators realized that they were dealing with a serial and highly dangerous criminal right in their midst. They focused their efforts on the vehicle, as it was easier to trace through databases. The police visited all owners of such cars, and soon they got lucky. During the inspection of one of these vehicles, they discovered a student ID belonging to the same woman who had been left to die in the snow, along with her earring. Inside the car, they also found the same type of tape used to bind her head and a stun gun. The owner of the car turned out to be a 21-year-old named Jorge Avila Torres, who was serving in the military at the very base where Amanda Snell's body had been found several months earlier. Moreover, he lived in the same building as her, just a few floors below. During the search of his room, investigators found a pistol he had purchased less than a month ago, along with numerous rounds of ammunition. On his computer, they discovered a significant amount of explicit videos depicting violence and cruelty. Some of these videos featured women who were unconscious. Photos of Torres, along with pictures of other men, was shown to all 3 women who had been attacked. They all unanimously identified him. His face well because during the assaults, he didn't even attempt to conceal it. Following this, Torres was arrested and placed in custody pending trial. Investigators suspected him of kidnapping one woman and assaulting 2 others, which seemed likely given the evidence. However, they faced another problem when they began to suspect Torres of Amanda's murder. There wasn't a single piece of evidence linking him to the crime. So, detectives devised a clever plan. They planted an informant in his cell, someone willing to wear a wire and engage him in conversation. Surprisingly, this tactic worked remarkably fast. Within a week, Torres started confessing to his crimes. He openly boasted about killing Amanda, stating he did it just because the opportunity presented itself. He added that he did it for the adrenaline and provided a detailed account of how he placed her body in the closet. Torres also mentioned that after the murder, he had to meticulously clean her room to erase any traces. However, unknowingly, he left behind a piece of evidence during the cleanup. The criminal revealed to his cellmate that he had sexually assaulted the victim on her bed using contraception. After moving her to the closet, Torres made her bed but removed the top sheet. However, he left the mattress pad, which the police immediately sent to the laboratory. Their experts found a tiny sample of male semen that matched Torres's DNA perfectly. Furthermore, Torres let slip to his informant that he had a pair of Nike sneakers that he kept in his car. Crime scene analysts seized the shoes and compared the sole pattern to the footprint found outside Amanda's closet. The sole pattern was an exact match. As a result, Torres was formally charged with murder, and he remained in custody awaiting trial. Meanwhile, a sample of his DNA had been uploaded to the FBI's database, and now we return to Zion. Several weeks after the sample was added to the database, local investigators got a perfect match between Torres's DNA and the semen samples found on Laura Hobbs's body. What followed was even more astonishing. It turned out that Torres was originally from Zion and was friends with the older brother of the second murdered girl, Crystal. This connection confirmed that both Laura and Crystal knew Torres, a fact corroborated by other kids in the area. At the time of the girls' deaths, Torres was just 16, and the police hadn't considered him a suspect at all. They were solely focused on Laura's father, who had spent 5 years in jail awaiting trial. Once the DNA match was found, Jerry's attorney demanded his client's immediate release and the dropping of all charges. This time, the prosecutor couldn't argue against it, as the discovery of Torres's semen on Laura's body eliminated the possibility of her father's involvement. After his release, Jerry announced his intention to sue the police and authorities for coercing a false confession from him and making him spend 5 years of imprisonment. They quickly realized they had no chance of winning this case. And in the event of a loss, they'd be held accountable for their misconduct and incompetence. So they offered him a settlement, which he accepted, receiving nearly $8 million. As for Torres, the legal process in Virginia 4 years after his arrest. He refused to admit guilt, but the jury unanimously found him guilty. He was sentenced to death for Amanda's murder, and for the attempted abduction of 2 other women, and the kidnapping of a third, he received 5 life sentences, plus 168 years in prison. Immediately after this, he was extradited to Illinois, where the trial for the murders of Laura and Crystal began. Initially, he denied his guilt, and his lawyer tried to argue that the semen found on the victim wasn't enough to prove his client's guilt. However, Torres was eventually presented with a deal. He was already facing the death penalty, and even if that were delayed for decades, as it often happens, he would never walk free. So, the criminal agreed to confess to the murders in exchange for an additional 100 years in prison and a transfer to a different facility, as he felt his life was in danger at his current one. The terms of the deal didn't require him to reveal all the details. It was sufficient for him to admit to the killings. As a result, Torres remains behind bars, awaiting the execution that has yet to occur. As for the police officers who coerced Jerry into signing a false confession, none of them faced any consequences. Jerry himself couldn't fully return to a normal life. He began using drugs and was arrested for resisting arrest, subsequently escaping from custody and receiving a 2-year prison sentence. He also couldn't reunite with his family and chose to live in Texas. After his release, Jerry gave an interview in which he admitted that the coerced confession had irreparably damaged his life. When asked why he had agreed to confess, he responded, "I found my daughter dead. They didn't even need to try to break me. I was already broken." Ultimately, both the local police and the county prosecutor's office faced well-deserved criticism from the national media and the public. Had they not fixated on a single suspect and instead conducted a thorough investigation, they would have had a far greater chance of catching the real perpetrator much sooner. Instead, their tunnel vision inadvertently allowed the killer to take another woman's life and attack 3 more victims. And those are just the cases that came to light. Moving on to the next case. Donna Grable. In 1995, Donna Grable endured relentless harassment in the form of nonstop phone calls. For 6 months, in Billerica, Massachusetts, she waited as her phone rang every 90 minutes, day and night, totaling no fewer than 2,688 calls. Each time she answered, she was met with nothing but a rush of air, followed by a click and a dial tone. There was never anyone on the other end. Desperate for answers, Donna reached out to the local police, who traced the calls to a home in suburban Potomac belonging to Feuder and Elizabeth James. However, the Jameses were completely innocent, and the real culprit turned out to be something far more unusual: a heating oil tank in their basement. The tank had not been in use for years, but its original manufacturer, Stewart Petroleum, had installed an auto-dialing device designed to call the company when the oil level was low. Malfunctioning after nearly a decade, the device had been repeatedly dialing Donna's number by mistake. The number was disconnected, but in February of 1995, Donna Grable set up her own 800 number for a business she ran from her home. She got the same number Stewart Petroleum once used to receive calls from their auto-dialing device. Shortly thereafter, The device on the oil tank reactivated and started making a non-stop series of calls to Grebel's residence. Nobody is certain what brought the oil tank to life. Harold Herman, a Bell Atlantic cable maintenance supervisor who traced the calls, said it might have been a power surge or a lightning strike. In the end, she was contacted over 2,000 times by an inanimate object. Melissa Tremblay. A girl went out for a walk and disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The police quickly joined the search, uncovering a series of eerie clues along the way. Despite their efforts, the case remained unsolved for 30 years. However, investigators eventually managed to crack it, revealing a shocking truth. Yet, even after the case was solved, some questions remain unanswered, leaving parts of the story still shrouded in mystery. Melissa Tremblay was born on March 1, 1977, in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Just a month after birth, her biological parents gave her up for adoption, and she was welcomed into the home of Jeanette and Robert Tremblay. Melissa grew up in Salem, New Hampshire, where she was an energetic and lively child. Her interests included fashion, singing, and reading, and she quickly made many friends at school. She also spent a lot of time at the Boys and Girls Club of America. At the age of 9, Melissa's life was shaken when her adoptive parents divorced, and her father became absent from her life. Later on, her mother, Jeanette, began a relationship with a man named Robert, but they did not live together. On September 11, 1988, when Melissa was 11, her mother took her to Lawrence to meet Robert. They often frequented a local bar, and since there was no one else to care for Melissa, Jeanette would bring her along. While her mother socialized inside the bar, Melissa would often play outside, with the only rule being not to venture too far from the bar. She spent time on the nearby streets, unaware that this seemingly mundane day would soon take a tragic turn. Because her mom frequented the bar, Melissa had become acquainted with some of the local kids and would often play with them. That particular day, she spent most of her time outdoors, periodically checking in with her mom. At one point, the bartender made her some popcorn, and Melissa told him she'd come back for it soon. However, she never returned to collect the snack. By 4 p.m., Jeanette started to grow concerned as hours had passed without hearing from Melissa. She went outside to check her car, but there was no sign of her daughter. Jeanette and Robert immediately began searching the area, going down street after street, but they couldn't find any trace of Melissa. They spent several hours looking, and by 9 p.m., Jeanette decided to call the police. Officers quickly joined the search, but by the time they arrived, it was already dark, and there was still no sign of Melissa. The difficulty of the search was compounded by the darkness, but the police persisted through the night. They also considered the possibility that Melissa had run away. But her mother firmly rejected this theory, stating that Melissa was afraid of the dark and would never venture off on her own. By the next day, there was still no sign of her, and the search continued without success. It wasn't until around 3 p.m. when a railroad worker made a call that would change the course of the investigation. The worker was conducting a routine inspection of an old rail yard located just a few hundred yards from the bar. The yard was quite expansive, with up to 8 tracks in its widest section, although some tracks hadn't been used in years. The area was filled with empty boxcars, and between 2 of them, the worker noticed something odd. As he approached, he realized it was a human body, prompting him to immediately call the police. Detectives arrived on the scene and quickly identified the body as Melissa Tremblay. In addition to the fact that she had been reported missing the day before, a card with her name from the Boys and Girls Club was found in a purse near her body. Melissa's body was found on tracks that were still in use, and one of her legs had been severed. Initially, it seemed as though a passing train might have been responsible for the injury, given the section of track was active. However, the lead detective quickly began to question this theory after observing several details that didn't align with it. For one, Melissa's purse, which contained a card with her name, was found nearly 20 yards away from her body. It seemed unlikely that a train accident could have thrown the purse that far. Additionally, the detective noticed a significant number of footprints and blood drops near the purse, which suggested that Melissa may have been attacked at that location before her body was moved to the tracks. This raised suspicions that the assailant had staged the scene to make it appear as though she had died in a train accident. Another important clue was the specific location where Melissa's body was found. It was an area that didn't seem like an accident site, but rather a place that might have been chosen intentionally to mislead investigators. The old rail yard, known for being a secluded spot frequented by homeless individuals and people using illegal substances, became a point of interest for the detectives. They wondered if someone from that community might have been involved in Melissa's death. As the body was sent for examination, police focused on collecting clues and speaking with potential witnesses to piece together the timeline of events. The first witness they interviewed was an employee from the railroad company. He recalled seeing a girl matching Melissa's description near the tracks the day before her body was found. Concerned about her safety, he asked her to leave, and she complied, walking away from the area. Next, detectives interviewed a woman who lived near the bar where Melissa's mother had been. She was familiar with Melissa, as her children had become friends with her, and Melissa often visited their home. On the day she went missing, Melissa had come by to invite the woman's children to play, but when the woman informed her that her children were grounded and couldn't go out, Melissa left on her own. The breakthrough came when detectives spoke to another witness, whose statement provided the first real lead in the case. The witness who had seen Melissa talking to a man near the rail yard provided a crucial lead in that he described the man as being large, unkempt, around 30 years old, with dark hair and a large beard. The van he was driving was brown, old, and rusty. With this information in hand, the police began canvassing the area, looking for similar vehicles and gathering more details about the man in question. Meanwhile, the medical examiner's findings ruled out the train as the cause of death. They determined that Melissa had suffered numerous bruises and 3 fatal stab wounds. There was no evidence of sexual assault and no foreign biological material was found on her body or clothes. The stabbed wounds were inflicted by someone who used their left hand, which suggested that the killer was likely left-handed. Reclassifying the case as a homicide, detectives honed in on the only solid lead they had: the description of the van and the man who had been seen with Melissa shortly before she went missing. The search for the suspect intensified, but they still faced significant challenges in connecting the dots. The police concentrated on finding similar vehicles in the area, but repeatedly hit dead ends. The challenge was that even if they found the right van, linking its owner to the murder would be nearly impossible without a confession. DNA analysis was not impossible without a confession. DNA analysis was not yet in use, and there were no additional pieces of evidence, like Melissa's belongings or fingerprints, likely to be found in the van. The police also kept trying to find new witnesses. They interviewed several hundred residents in the area, but this effort yielded no results. Detectives continued searching for the van and other clues for several months, but the case eventually went cold. Melissa's murder received significant media coverage, and many people began blaming her mother for what happened. They were outraged that Jeanette let her 11-year-old daughter wander the streets alone, especially near such a dangerous place as a rail yard. What infuriated them even more was that while Melissa roamed the streets for hours unattended, her mother was drinking in a bar. Rumors began spreading in the newspapers that Jeanette had developed a drinking problem after her divorce and was struggling with her parental responsibilities. People also started blaming social services for failing Melissa by not intervening in the situation. Amid all these accusations, Jeanette refused to speak with media or answer their questions. When reporters reached out to Child Protective Services, they stated they were aware of the family's complicated situation and had tried to take some measures, but revoking Jeanette's parental rights had never been considered. Since then, there had been no progress in the case. Police repeatedly reviewed it and examined potential suspects, but this yielded no results. In 2000, 12 years after the murder, investigators identified their first potential suspect, Tommy Lynn Sells. He confessed to 22 murders, and investigators in Melissa's case found that many details of his crime closely matched those of her murder. Moreover, Tommy resembled the van driver seen with the girl, and he often spent nights in empty boxcars while traveling across various states. Detectives began investigating his possible involvement in Melissa's murder, but they eventually concluded that he was unlikely to be responsible. They couldn't find any evidence placing Tommy near Lawrence at that time. Instead, they determined he was probably in another state. The case remained cold for several more years until 2013 when detectives unexpectedly obtained a new lead. They arrested a man from Lawrence for an unrelated case, and during questioning, he suddenly claimed to know some details about Melissa Tremblay's murder. The man said that in 1988, when he was just 13, he used to steal cars for a living. He spent a lot of time on the streets looking for suitable vehicles, and on the day Melissa disappeared, he saw a girl resembling her. She was sitting on the steps of that same bar, and next to her was a man named Mike. The witness knew Mike, but his family had warned him to stay away from that man because of his questionable reputation. The boy walked past them, and about 10 minutes later, on his way back, he saw the girl leaving the bar with Mike. At some point, another man whom the witness didn't recognize approached them, and the three of them continued walking together. The police asked the witness why he had remained silent for 25 years. He replied that at the time, he didn't want any unnecessary contact with the police. However, when he learned about Melissa's murder and realized he might have seen her, he asked his brother if he should tell someone, but he advised him to stay quiet. However, the detectives immediately found a serious contradiction in the story. According to the witness, he saw the girl on the bar steps when it was already dark outside, but Melissa was reported missing around 4 p.m. when it was still daylight. Given that all the bar patrons and staff were aware of her disappearance, and her mother had been searching for her for hours, the detectives found it highly unlikely that Melissa could have been right outside the bar without being noticed. The police considered the possibility that the witness had either seen a different girl or his account was inaccurate. Despite this, they investigated Mike for potential involvement, but made no progress. Nevertheless, the witness's story brought renewed attention to the old case, and in February 2014, it was reopened. By then, DNA analysis was widely used, and the police hoped that experts could find some new clues by re-examining all the available evidence. They examined Melissa's clothing and other items, but found no foreign DNA. However, there was something else among the evidence. Samples taken from under Melissa's nails, collected in case she had scratched. The experts analyzed these samples and indeed found traces of foreign skin, which were promptly sent to the lab. But there was a new problem. Experts were able to extract a DNA profile of an unknown male, but it was only partial. It wasn't enough to get a match in the database, but the investigators were determined not to give up. Sometime later, they reached out to a company specializing in genetic genealogy. The company analyzed the sample and began searching for potential matches in available databases. This was a challenging task because they had to work with a partial profile, which made it impossible to identify the person with absolute certainty. Nevertheless, through meticulous work, they managed to find a possible distant relative of the sample's owner in the databases. This led them to a specific family with the last name McClendon. Detectives began investigating the members of this family, trying to determine who might have committed the crime. This process took several years due to the primary challenge: the lack of a complete DNA profile to definitively prove the guilt of any family member. Therefore, investigators carefully examined who among them could have been in Lawrence in 1988, matched all the criteria like age and so on. Eventually, they focused on two brothers, one of whom was Marvin McClendon. Marvin lived in Alabama, but investigators discovered that in the late 80s, he lived just 20 minutes away from Lawrence and worked as a carpenter. Digging into Marvin's past, they learned that he frequently visited a church located just a few hundred yards from the bar where Melissa was last seen. Marvin had also worked as a prison guard for about 30 years, but with breaks, one of which occurred in 1988. The intriguing findings didn't stop there. Police found that Marvin owned an old brown van during those years, which he used for work. Despite this, Marvin had no criminal record, aside from numerous traffic fines for not wearing a seatbelt. He had been married twice, but both wives had left him. He had 2 sons from his first marriage, but was not actively involved in their lives. Finally, Marvin was left-handed, unlike all his close male relatives. While detectives were investigating this suspect, Melissa's mother passed away in February 2015 at the age of 70. She had struggled with a severe illness for a long time and never found out who killed her daughter. After gathering all the information on Marvin and checking his other relatives, detectives concluded that he was the most likely perpetrator. In 2021, they went to Alabama to question him about that time in the late 80s. Eventually, they brought up the murder of Melissa Tremblay, and Marvin claimed he had nothing to do with it. When told that DNA from one of his close relatives was found on the victim, Marvin suggested that the killer might be his brother. That same year, Marvin voluntarily provided his DNA sample, but experts still couldn't establish a complete match. The partial profile from under Melissa's nails only indicated that Marvin was either closely related to the killer or was the killer himself. However, investigators who had already examined all his close male relatives knew that none of them could have committed the crime, leaving Marvin as the prime suspect. They also understood that without a full DNA match, it would be extremely challenging for the prosecution to secure a conviction. As a result, they spent another year trying to find any additional clues. Detectives also checked Mike, the man whom the 13-year-old boy claimed to have seen with a girl resembling Melissa on the bar steps. After obtaining his DNA sample, experts determined that it didn't match the skin particles found under the victim's nails, ruling him out as a suspect. They visited Marvin several times, asking him various questions, and in April 2022, they finally decided to arrest him. Despite his continued claims of innocence, Marvin allegedly made a suspicious remark during his arrest. He told one of the officers, "At least I got to enjoy 20 years of my pension." Marvin, who was 74 years old at the time, was sent to jail awaiting trial. The judge had to place him under constant protection because other inmates quickly learned about his charges and the fact that he had worked as a prison guard. Without DNA from someone in Marvin's family was found under the victim's nails, but none of his close relatives had the opportunity to commit the crime. As for distant relatives, a match with their DNA would be less evident, and experts could easily see the difference. They also pointed out that in 1988, Marvin frequently visited a church on the same street as the bar, owned a similar van, and matched the description given by a witness who saw a girl near his vehicle. The trial began in December 2022. Marvin's lawyer immediately focused on the lack of a complete DNA profile of the perpetrator, claiming that without it, his client's guilt couldn't be confirmed. The defense then called two experts. One was a forensic specialist who testified that, based on crime scene photos, she couldn't confirm that the killer was indeed left-handed. The case took a dramatic turn when the jury deliberated for nearly a week but ultimately failed to reach a unanimous verdict. Some jurors believed that without a complete DNA profile, they could not definitively convict Marvin, which led the judge to declare a mistrial on December 27th. The prosecution, however, wasted no time and announced plans for a retrial, scheduled for September 30th, 2024. As the trial approaches, Marvin remains in jail. At 76 years old and suffering from various health problems, there is concern that he may not live to see the end of the new trial. If the court fails to convict him again, there is a real possibility that Marvin could be released, leaving Melissa's murder unresolved and the truth about what happened to her still hidden. The case continues to hang in the balance, and the question of whether justice will ever be fully served remains uncertain. Mikhail Bush. A young family moved into a quiet, peaceful apartment complex, thinking they had found the perfect place to start their new life. However, just days later their world would be turned upside down. What unfolded next shocked the entire country. Though the case was resolved quickly, its aftermath left a lasting impact, prompting crucial changes in the law. Mikhail Bush was born on February 13, 1997, in the Canadian province of Alberta. She grew up surrounded by love, with her parents and a younger sister, whom Mikhail was incredibly close to. Her sister saw Mikhail as a role model, and their bond was unbreakable. Mikhail was known for her cheerful, energetic, and kind nature, qualities that naturally drew people to her and helped her make many friends throughout her life. One of Mikhail's greatest passions was ice skating. From a young age, she and her parents would frequent local rinks, where Mikhail's love for the sport blossomed. As she grew older, skating became a central part of her life. During high school, Mikhail met Cody, a boy who would soon become an important figure in her life. They started dating, and their relationship seemed to promise a bright future together. It didn't take long for Mikhail and Cody to realize that they were meant to spend the rest of their lives together. After graduation, they began making plans for their future as a couple. Mikhail, driven by her desire to help others, found a job at a charity organization, where she poured her heart into her work. Inspired by her passion for making a difference, she decided to pursue a career in healthcare. In 2017, Mikhail enrolled in a local college to earn her nursing degree, which she successfully completed. After graduating, she returned to her beloved job at the charity center, eager to continue her mission of helping those in need. But life had more surprises in store for her. Not long after settling into her career, Mikhail discovered she was pregnant. She and Cody were thrilled by the news, and Mikhail in the very place where they shared so many fond memories, on the ice rink. In 2020, their happiness was complete when they welcomed their son, Noah, into the world. They began to build their life together as a family, with Cody working in pipeline construction, a job that had him traveling across Canada frequently. Despite the challenges of his constant travels, the couple was determined to create a loving home for Noah, filled with the same warmth and joy that had marked their relationship from the beginning. With Cody's new job, the family moved to a small town called Hinton. It was a more remote area. But for the first time, Cody's job no longer required him to travel constantly, allowing the family to settle down and spend more time together. In early September 2021, Mikhail, Cody, and their son Noah moved into a new apartment in a quiet residential complex on the outskirts of town. At 24 years old, Mikhail was settling into her new routine, and Noah, just 16, was starting to adjust to life in the peaceful town. They were excited about their new home, which was surrounded by nature and parks, offering a peaceful retreat from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. On September 16th, Cody left for work as usual, and Mikhail stayed home to care for Noah. Cody's shift ended around 6 p.m., and he looked forward to returning home to spend the evening with his family. However, when he arrived, neither Mikhail nor Noah was home. Cody checked every room in the apartment and looked out into the yard, but there was no sign of Mikhail or Noah. At first, he thought Mikhail might have taken Noah for a walk to one of the nearby parks. But then he noticed something strange. Their son's stroller was still inside the apartment, indicating that they hadn't gone far. As he continued to search, Cody found something even more unsettling. On the kitchen table, there were plates with half-prepared food, as though Mikhail had started making lunch, but had abruptly stopped and left the house. Panic started to set in. Cody decided to check the nearby parks and playgrounds, hoping to find Mikhail and Noah enjoying the outdoors. But after searching the entire area with no luck, he returned home, feeling more desperate. Still hoping for some answers, Cody began calling family and friends, thinking someone might have picked them up. But no one had seen Mikhail or Noah that day. He kept trying to reach Mikhail, but her phone went unanswered, adding to his growing sense of fear and uncertainty. The whole situation felt increasingly bizarre, and Cody knew he needed to take action. He made the difficult decision to call the police. By the time he placed the call, one of his friends had arrived at the apartment complex to help. Together, they searched the area once more, hoping to find some sign of Mikhail and Noah, but there was still no trace of them. It seemed as though Mikhail had vanished into thin air. The police arrived shortly after and immediately joined the search. They methodically checked the apartment complex, the wooded area behind it, and the nearby streets. Officers began going door to door, questioning residents in hopes of uncovering any clues that might shed light on Mikhail and Noah's disappearance. After hours of searching, their persistence paid off. A neighbor finally came forward with a crucial piece of information. The neighbor had seen a woman who resembled Mikhail running away from the complex earlier that day. The woman wasn't screaming or calling for help, and notably, her son wasn't with her. The strange sighting only deepened the mystery of Mikhail and Noah's sudden disappearance. The police decided to follow up on this lead and asked the complex manager for access to the CCTV footage. They reviewed hours of recordings but couldn't find any sign of Mikhail. But then something completely unexpected caught their attention. Around noon, the same neighbor who claimed to have seen Mikhail was captured on camera carrying 2 large garbage bags out of the building. The police went straight to the dumpster to examine the contents of those bags. When they opened one, they were met with a horrifying sight. Inside was Noah's body, along with some of Mikhail's belongings, including her phone. This discovery immediately changed the course of the investigation. Detectives knew they had to proceed carefully, as Mikhail's whereabouts were still unknown. They suspected the neighbor was directly involved in the crime and decided to search his apartment. But there was a problem. The man lived right next door to Mikhail's apartment, where Cody and other family members were waiting. The 2 apartments shared a wall, and the police were concerned that what they might find inside the neighbor's apartment could trigger an uncontrollable situation. To avoid this scenario, the officers came up with a plan. They asked Cody and his family members to temporarily leave their apartment, explaining that investigators needed to. What they didn't tell Cody was that his son's body had just been discovered only a few dozen yards away. As soon as Cody left, the police went straight to the neighbor's apartment. They requested permission to search the unit, and the man voluntarily agreed. When investigators reached the bathroom, they found Mikhail. Her body was lying in the tub, completely unclothed. After this heartbreaking discovery, the neighbor, 53-year-old Robert Major, was immediately arrested, and detectives now had to piece together what had happened inside that apartment. While waiting for medical examiners to determine the exact causes of death, the police began looking into Robert's background, and what they found was truly shocking. Robert had an extensive criminal record spanning several decades. He had been charged more than 24 times, most for sexual offenses. But despite his repeated arrests, Robert had only served short prison sentences. During his time in custody, he was evaluated by multiple psychiatrists, and he openly admitted to them that he really enjoyed committing these acts and took pleasure in his crimes. With multiple expert evaluations on record, authorities knew for sure Robert was likely to reoffend. But instead of keeping him behind bars after his numerous crimes, he was released in 2016. The only measure the police took was to issue a public warning, informing the community about Robert and the threat he posed. Robert was also required to register in a special offender database. He was banned from living near women, children, schools, or playgrounds, prohibited from leaving his city, which was located about 190 miles from Hinton, and ordered to meet with a police representative on a regular basis. But these restrictions quickly became irrelevant. Canadian law basically removed individuals from the registry and lifted their restrictions if they went a year without committing another crime. Because of this, Robert fell off the radar of law enforcement several years before the tragedy. At some point, he moved to Hinton and settled in a residential complex filled with families and children. None of the local police officers were aware of his criminal history. The management of the apartment complex, even if they wanted to, had no way of accessing this information, let alone the residents themselves. Medical experts soon completed their examination of the bodies, while Robert, shortly after his arrest, gave a partial confession, and his words shocked even the most seasoned investigators. On top of that, they managed to gather additional evidence and witness statements that helped piece together the full picture of what happened on that day. That morning, Mikhail and Noah went for a walk in the nearby park. When they returned home, the building manager approached Mikhail to discuss an issue. The problem was that Cody, Lines, would often come home with his boots and clothes covered in dirt, leaving muddy tracks all the way to their apartment door. The manager asked Mikhail to address the situation, and she promised to clean it up right away. After their conversation, Mikhail went back inside, put Noah down for a nap, and started preparing lunch. Around this time, she also called a friend. This friend later recalled hearing a knock at Mikhail's door during their conversation, followed by a man's voice. He offered to help clean the hallway, but the friend didn't catch the rest of the exchange. Shortly after, Mikhail returned to the kitchen, finished her call, and sent a message to a family member around 2 p.m. From there, one critical question remained unanswered for investigators. How did Mikhail end up in Robert's apartment? Robert himself refused to clarify this particular moment, leaving to speculate. Perhaps he lured her there under some pretense, maybe by continuing the conversation about cleaning the hallway or asking for her help with something else. One way or another, Mikhail ended up inside Robert's apartment, and this is where his confession began. Almost immediately after she walked through the door, he attacked her and tried to strangle her. But for nearly 10 minutes, he struggled to succeed. In the end, he managed her. He then dragged her body to the bathroom before heading to her apartment, where he took Noah and ended his life as well. After committing these horrific acts, Robert placed Noah's body, along with Mikhail's clothes and belongings, into garbage bags and dumped them in a container outside the building. It seemed he had no further plan as Mikhail's body was simply left in the bathroom. Although, he tried to mislead investigators by claiming that Mikhail had run off from the complex, possibly hoping that police wouldn't think to look inside his apartment. As for his motives, they remain unclear. The details of the case, including the full account of his confession, were never made fully public. Investigators shared only bits of information with media, leaving room for speculation. The reason behind Mikhail's murder was relatively straightforward. Not only did Robert find satisfaction in causing harm, but he also killed her with the intent of SA. However, Noah's murder was more perplexing. Investigators suggested that Robert may have killed him out of fear that Noah could identify him. Another theory is that Noah woke up and started crying, which may have scared Robert, thinking the noise could draw attention from the neighbors. One way or another, Robert's main motive became crystal clear through his numerous conversations with psychiatrists. He simply took genuine pleasure in harming others, especially those who were physically weaker than him. It's worth noting that even prison didn't stop him. During one of his previous sentences, Robert assaulted a cellmate, which led to additional charges. With news of this case spread across the country, many were horrified, not only by the brutality of the crime but also by the fact that such a dangerous man had been allowed to live freely. Public outrage grew even stronger when details of what happened during the trial came to light, but more on that later. Robert openly admitted to psychiatrists that he enjoyed committing such crimes, and all of them agreed there was a very high likelihood he would do it again. But despite this, he was released back into society, and eventually, authorities stopped monitoring him altogether. The residents of that complex had no way of knowing about his criminal past either. Even if he had remained on a sex offender registry, the system in Canada works very differently than in the US. In Canada, only law enforcement officials can access the registry, not the general public. This left many Canadians outraged as the laws prioritized protecting the privacy of a family had moved into that complex just 15 days before the tragedy, only to become victims of a man who lived literally next door. This devastating injustice pushed Cody and the rest of the family to fight for change. They became actively involved in drafting a new piece of legislation named in Noah's memory. The main goal of the bill was to ensure that repeat offenders are monitored for their entire lives, not just for a short period after their release. The bill that was proposed sought to create a public registry of offenders like Robert, making it easier for people to check if someone with a criminal past was living in their neighborhood. The intention was to prevent future harm and give communities a sense of security. Robert, however, didn't try to deny his guilt. He admitted to his crimes and was sentenced to life in prison. Despite being behind bars for the rest of his life, Robert expressed a disturbing belief that he was still a good person, despite his past actions. In the end, he was sentenced to life in prison, but with the possibility of parole in 25 years. If he lives that long, he would be 78 years old by the time of his eligibility for parole. There's no certainty that, even at that age, he wouldn't still present a danger to others. As for the bill that the victim's family is fighting for, progress has been agonizingly slow. Years of advocacy have passed, yet the legislation has not been passed, and it remains uncertain whether it ever will be. Moving on to the next case. Kimberly Killer. On the morning of January 12, 1999, a woman's nearly beheaded body was discovered inside a car in Council Bluffs, Iowa. She was identified as Kimberly, and investigators determined that she had died 4 and 6 hours before being found. Authorities collected her clothing and other items from the crime scene, hoping that advancements in forensic science would eventually help identify the person responsible. In 2014, with improved DNA testing techniques, investigators submitted the evidence to the Iowa State Lab for analysis. By 2017, forensic officials informed law enforcement that they had discovered an unknown male DNA profile on an item of a personal nature, one that only Kimberly and her attacker would have had contact with. In August 2020, investigators compiled a list of 6 men who may have been in contact with Kimberly in the final hours of her life. The DNA from these individuals was compared to the unknown male profile found at the scene. The results revealed a match to 52-year-old Matt W. Kennedy, a resident of Fairfield, Montana, who had previously lived in Council Bluffs. Matt was not only Kimberly's stepbrother but also the last known person to have seen her alive. In October 2020, investigators received further confirmation when the DNA, found on an item that the suspect likely handled during the attack, also matched Matt Kennedy. He was arrested in mid-October 2020, bringing an end to a decades-long search for Kimberly's killer. Moving on to the next case. Reynosa Girls Case. In February 2019, Spain ranked as the second most visited country in the world, welcoming an astonishing 83,700,000 tourists. Visitors flock to experience its rich culture, admire its breathtaking landscapes, and unwind on its scenic beaches. While Spain is generally considered a safe destination, with crime rates lower than in many other European nations, it is not without its darker side. Among its unsettling mysteries are the disappearances of Manuela Bugifa and Virginia S. Bajo. On an April afternoon, 14-year-old Virginia S. Pedro asked her mother for money, saying she needed it to buy a birthday cake for a party she planned to attend. However, Virginia never showed up at the celebration she had mentioned. Instead, she secretly met up with her close friend, 13-year-old Manuela Bugifa. The two girls boarded a train to Reynosa, a town about 18 miles from where they lived, intending to visit a nightclub. Knowing their parents would disapprove, they deliberately kept their plans hidden. The girls had invited a third friend to join them, but she, declined and chose to stay home instead. Around 9 p.m., Virginia and Manuela left the nightclub and began their journey back. Investigators later determined that the girls had likely resorted to hitchhiking after realizing there were no trains running at that hour. A witness, who happened to be from their hometown, was the last person to see them. She was unable to offer them a ride since her car was already full. But she later told authorities that she saw the girls getting into a white Seat 127 with a Valladolid license plate near the town's main street. Manuela and Virginia were never seen again. However, there was no evidence suggesting they had intended to run away. They had very little money on them and were only dressed in the clothes they had worn that day. Nothing was missing from their bedrooms at home. As time passed with no sign of the girls, their worried families reported them missing to the Civil Guard. However, they were met with resistance from the officers. In 1992, the protocols for missing children were not as strict or immediate as they are today. The families of Manuela and Virginia were told they need to wait 48 hours before a search could be launched. This would later cause the civil guards to receive criticism and backlash, as it's understood that the first 24 hours after an individual goes missing are the most vital. Virginia's sister recalled being told by an agent they have gone to a party. They will come back whenever they want. During the early 1990s, a Spanish journalist named Paco Lobarton presented the public service program Who Knows Where, which is similar to the BBC's Crime Watch program in the UK. Viewers could phone into the show with tips and information about unsolved cases, with Who Knows Where focusing specifically on missing person cases. The show aired an episode about Manuela and Virginia, and it received dozens of calls as a result. Alleged sightings placed the girls all over Spain, while other callers appeared to be unwell. Cruel hoaxers who said they would bring harm to the girls and that their parents would never see them alive again. Family members traveled as far as Asturias to see if they could track down their missing loved ones, but instead were met with young girls who bore a resemblance to the pair. No trace of the real Manuela and Virginia was ever found. In October of 1994, a group of friends walking near the Rey K. Hardar Reservoir, about 25 miles from where the girls were last seen, found two skulls. Two members of the group were writers for a newspaper that published their findings without analysis or forewarning the families claiming the skulls could possibly belong to the two missing girls. The lead, after all that, turned out to be a dead end. The skulls did not belong to Manuela and Virginia. They were too old, believed to date back to the 1930s. 3 years later, in 1997, a witness claimed that the girls were in Madrid with what he described as a punk community. He alleged that Manuela had cut her hair short and dyed it blue with one small white section. Investigators put together composite images of the girls and how they may have looked in 1997. But when they finally located the women the witness had described, it was discovered they were not, in fact, Manuela and Virginia. In February 2001, 2 more skulls were discovered, but they were determined to belong to victims of the Civil War. Furthermore, in February 2018, a human jawbone was found in a reservoir in Cantabria, but it did not belong to the missing girls. Then in 2021, new hope came for the families of Manuela and Virginia when a woman called into a TV program about unsolved cases to tell them that 1 year before the girls went missing, she and one of her friends had suffered an attempted kidnapping. After alerting the TV show, the woman gave a statement to the Civil Guard, which led to a new line of inquiry being investigated. The woman and her friend had struggled with the driver, causing him to veer off the side of the road. She and her friend then took the opportunity to flee. The details of the case were chillingly similar to that of Manuela and Virginia. The two women had been hitchhiking and had been picked up by someone in a white seat 127. More hopeful still, the witness was able to identify the man driving the vehicle, and he became a suspect in the case. He had a criminal record which included being arrested 4 times for attempted sexual assault. Another suspect came to light around this time, but law enforcement never recovered a photograph of him from 1992. The suspect was described as a young man between the ages of 20 and 25 in 1992. Investigators discovered that he had temporarily left the country in August of that same year. When questioned by authorities, he gave conflicting statements. At first, he denied knowing the girls, but later admitted during an interview with the Civil Guard that a friend had introduced him to them at the nightclub. However, he insisted that he never saw them again after that brief encounter. Over the years, multiple claims have surfaced suggesting that the remains of Manuela and Virginia may be hidden in the Fonteria mine. An anonymous tipster had alerted police to this possibility early in the investigation. Although their bodies were not found at the time, authorities noted that a thick layer of mud obscured visibility to the bottom of the mine. Additionally, the nearby Cerveda cave has never been searched, despite the Civil Guard stating in 1993 that it would be an ideal location to conceal bodies. In 2021, the Civil Guard reopened the case, but even now, Manuela, Virginia, and their families are still awaiting justice. The disappearance of Céline Feghart. A young French woman embarked on a journey to Britain to visit her relatives for Christmas, but she mysteriously disappeared along the way. Authorities swiftly launched an extensive search, and the case quickly gained widespread media attention in both France and the UK. As investigators followed a series of clues, they inched closer to uncovering the truth, only to find something far more disturbing than they had anticipated. Céline Feghart was born on May 23, 1976, in Besançon, a quiet and picturesque town near the Swiss border in France. Céline was raised in a warm and caring household alongside her parents, 2 brothers and a sister. Her father worked as a farmer, and she and her siblings often spent their time outdoors, assisting him in maintaining the farm. At school, Céline was an active student, excelling in sports and forming strong friendships. When she was 14, her parents took her on a trip to Britain, a place she immediately fell in love with. From that moment on, she dreamed of one day making it her home. Motivated by her cousin, who worked as a hotel manager in the UK, Céline chose to pursue an education that would prepare her for a career in the hospitality industry. After completing school, she enrolled in a local university to study accounting while continuing to visit her cousin in England whenever she had the chance. One summer, he helped her secure a job at a hotel, allowing her to gain hands-on experience before eventually returning home. In late 1995, at the age of 19, Celine made plans to visit Britain once again for the Christmas holiday. During that time, public train services in France were facing disruptions, prompting her parents to seek alternative travel arrangements. They reached out to a family friend, a truck driver, who agreed to give Celine a ride to Folkestone while delivering cargo to England. From there, she intended to continue her journey to Fordingbridge, a town approximately 150 miles, 250 kilometers away, where her cousin lived. On December 18th, Celine set off, expecting to reach her cousin's hotel by the evening. Her parents waited for her call to confirm she had arrived safely. But as the night wore on, there was no word from her. Without a mobile phone, Celine's family had no way to contact her and could only wait, hoping she would eventually arrive at the hotel. That night, they finally received a call, but it wasn't from Celine. Instead, it was her cousin, who informed them that she still hadn't shown up and asked if her plans had changed. Growing increasingly anxious, her parents, left with no other options, decided to reach out to the police. French authorities immediately contacted their British counterparts, who wasted no time in launching a search for the missing young woman. The first step in the investigation was speaking with Celine's parents, who traveled to England to assist with the case. They informed the police about the family friend, a truck driver, who had offered Celine a ride to the UK. Investigators managed to track him down, and he confirmed that he had dropped her off in Folkestone before heading in a different direction. While at the truck stop, he had encountered another French trucker who was traveling to Newbury, a town roughly an hour's drive from Celine's cousin's hotel. The second driver agreed to give Celine a ride, and investigators were able to track him down as well. He informed the police that he had dropped her off at a truck stop in Newbury. While there, she attempted to use a payphone to contact her cousin and arrange for a pickup, but for some unknown reason, she was unable to get through. By that point, it was already 4:30 p.m. The driver suggested that she take a train to her cousin's town, but there was a complication. The nearest train station was several dozen miles away, and he couldn't drive her there since his delivery route took him in a different direction. Wanting to assist her, he began asking other truckers in the parking lot if anyone could offer Celine a ride. The first trucker he approached declined, explaining that he planned to rest before continuing his journey. However, the second trucker agreed, mentioning that he was heading to Salisbury, which was only about a 30-minute drive from Celine's cousin's town. He even mentioned she could probably catch an 8 p.m. bus from there. With no other options left, Celine went with the third driver, and that's where her trail disappeared. Detectives tried to track this man down, but they didn't have enough solid information to identify him. The second driver, who had handed her over, couldn't recall the license plate number and only remembered that the truck was a white Mercedes. He also provided a description of the man. He was around 35 years old, had short blonde hair and a beard. The second driver also mentioned that something about this man struck him as suspicious. There was something unsettling about his behavior, but he still let Celine go with him because, at that point, she simply had no other choice. Police began to suspect that the third driver might have been involved in Celine's disappearance. Using the witness's description, they created a composite sketch and shared it with the local media. As for the first two drivers, investigators thoroughly checked their alibis and found solid evidence proving they had been in other locations at the time. Detectives soon uncovered a troubling detail that made them even more suspicious of the third driver. Remember how he told Celine she could catch an evening bus to her cousin's town from Salisbury? Well, it turned out that no such bus existed. Investigators wasted no time getting the word out about they shared her story, along with the suspect's composite sketch, through newspapers and TV. The case quickly grabbed national attention in both Britain and France. It was just days before Christmas, and the disappearance of a young woman during the holiday season struck a chord with the public. On top of that, there were fears that Celine might have fallen victim to a serial killer. Over the past 2 years, several young women had been murdered in the same area. Police believed these cases were linked to a single perpetrator, and now they were worried Celine's disappearance could be connected to him. As a result, the local police launched a full-scale search. Over 100 officers were assigned to the case, along with helicopters and even an airplane to scan the area from above. They concentrated their efforts along the route the third driver was believed to have taken with Celine, but despite all their efforts, they found no trace of her. Unfortunately, the first week of the search yielded no results. Both the police and Celine's family made numerous public appeals, urging anyone who might know something about her whereabouts or the driver himself to come forward. But every lead they followed quickly turned into a dead end. This went on for over a week, until the morning of December 29th, when police received a chilling call. A man driving near the town of Worcester had pulled over to adjust his windshield wipers. While walking along the roadside, he noticed something odd partially covered by snow. Curious, he went closer and, to his horror, realized it was a human body. Shaken, he immediately rushed home and called the police. Officers arrived at the scene and found the body of a young woman, but at first, they couldn't identify her. Initially, they thought it might be the remains of a local woman who had disappeared after leaving a nightclub, but the theory was quickly ruled out. It wasn't until the following day, December 30th, that police confirmed the body was Celine's. Her cousin was brought in to identify her, sparing her parents the heartbreaking task of doing it themselves. Police quickly noticed one important detail. The highway where Celine's body was found was almost in the opposite direction of where she had been heading. This only strengthened their theory that the truck driver who had given her a ride was likely responsible for her murder. All of Celine's clothing and personal belongings were missing, and officers found no trace of them near the site where her body was discovered. The autopsy revealed multiple bruises and abrasions consistent with heavy blows, as well as evidence of strangulation. Medical examiners also found signs of SA on Celine's body, but there was no biological material that could lead them to the perpetrator. One chilling detail stood out. The examiners determined that Celine's body had likely been left by the roadside only about 24 hours before it was found. With 11 days having passed since her disappearance, detectives speculated that the killer may have kept her alive for most of that time or even transported her body with him. The second driver who had helped Celine mentioned that the suspect's truck was equipped with an industrial freezer, which suggested the killer could have preserved her body at low temperatures for days. Despite all this, the police still had no solid leads on the driver's identity. However, a conversation with Celine's parents revealed an intriguing detail. She had been carrying 2 bottles of champagne as Christmas gifts. These, along with all her other belongings, were never found. It seemed likely that the killer had taken them, which gave investigators a potential new angle to explore. This champagne was a specific French brand that wasn't sold in Britain, making those 2 bottles completely unique in the country. Police decided to use this as leverage and sent information about the bottles to the media, along with photos of identical champagne. They hoped that the perpetrator might have shown them to someone or even shared them with friends or family. But unfortunately, this lead also went nowhere. Without any other leads in hand, investigators decided to take an unprecedented step. Despite the absence of the perpetrator's DNA on the victim's body, in early January of the following year, they initiated the first mass DNA collection in Britain's history. The police focused their efforts on drivers of Mercedes trucks and similar models. This process took over a month, and detectives managed to test more than 5,000 drivers. Most of them willingly provided their samples, but there were some who refused. Investigators put them on a separate list for further scrutiny, thinking that one of those individuals might be the killer. Meanwhile, Celine's case continued to gain widespread attention in both British and French media. The police received thousands of tips and leads, but unfortunately, none of them brought the detectives any closer to catching the killer. This continued until mid-February when one tip finally caught the investigators' attention. A man called the police after seeing the suspect's sketch on the news and said it looked strikingly similar to one of his co-workers, a 36-year-old truck driver named Stuart Little. He also mentioned that Stuart drove a Mercedes truck with a refrigeration unit. This lead prompted detectives to start digging into Stuart's background. The first thing they uncovered was Stuart's extensive criminal history, though it consisted of non-violent offenses. Next, they decided to approach him carefully and ask for a DNA sample, presenting it as a routine part of their investigation involving thousands of drivers across Britain. However, Stuart refused to provide a sample, which only deepened their suspicions. After several more attempts to persuade him, though, Stewart eventually gave in and agreed to the test. As soon as they had his DNA, the police secured a warrant to search his truck. That's when they found their first major evidence: traces of blood on the mattress in the sleeping area and in other parts of the cab. Testing confirmed it was Celine's blood, and that was enough for an arrest. The police also obtained a warrant to search Stewart's house. In his garage, they discovered Celine's personal belongings, the ones she had with her when she disappeared. But that wasn't all. Investigators noticed something odd about Stewart's tachograph, the device truck drivers are required to use by law to track their driving hours. It appeared that on the day Celine's body was dumped, Stewart had deliberately sealed information about his movements. However, he made a mistake. After disposing of the body, he resumed work without filling in the missing data. This created a suspicious gap in his driving log, which detectives believed corresponded to the time he transported Celine's body to the roadside. During his first interrogation, Stewart denied any involvement in the murder, claiming he had never even picked up Celine. But when police brought in the other driver, who identified Stewart in a lineup, his story changed. He now admitted to giving Celine a ride and claimed they had consensual intercourse. As for her belongings found in his garage, Stewart insisted she had simply forgotten them when he dropped her off. Naturally, investigators weren't quick to believe Stewart's story. They continued searching for evidence and soon found a witness who had seen him the day before Celine's body was discovered. The witness spotted Stewart near a warehouse about 50 miles from where the body was found. He was seen starting a fire next to his truck, and it appeared he was burning something. When police confronted Stewart about this, he claimed he'd started the fire to warm up his truck brakes, which had supposedly frozen due to the weather. Officers decided to search the area near the warehouse, and it didn't take long for them to find something disturbing. Underneath a fence, they discovered Celine's underwear. It was stained with her blood. Piecing together all the evidence, investigators came up with the most likely timeline of events. When Stewart picked up Celine, he drove to a secluded area where he assaulted and killed her. Based on the blood evidence found in his truck, they believe Stewart kept her body on the lower bunk in his cab for 10 days while continuing to make deliveries as if nothing had happened. Shockingly, just a week after the murder, Stewart went home to celebrate Christmas with his wife and children, while Celine's body remained just a few yards away in his truck. At some point, he decided to dispose of the body. Investigators found receipts showing Stewart had purchased a shovel, an axe, and a saw, likely with the intention of dismembering her remains. However, for some reason, he abandoned that plan and simply left her body near the roadside. Detectives soon uncovered another chilling detail. The day after Christmas, Stewart gave those 2 bottles of rare French champagne to an acquaintance as a gift. When detectives questioned him about it, Stewart claimed he bought the bottles from another French truck driver, but investigators didn't believe a word of it. On top of that, they uncovered another intriguing detail. Stewart had always worn a beard, but he completely shaved it off after the murder, right around the time the suspect sketch started appearing in the news. They also figured out why Celine couldn't reach her cousin when she tried to call him from a payphone. It turned out that the UK had recently changed its phone codes, and Celine had his number written down with the old code in her notebook. Unaware of this update, she dialed the outdated number, and her call never went through. For Stewart's family, friends, and co-workers, these revelations were a complete shock. To them, he had always seemed like a devoted family man and a reliable friend. At first, many even refused to believe he could have been involved. But as the media revealed the mounting evidence against him, they had no choice but to face the horrifying truth of who Stewart really was. Stewart's trial began in October of that year, and despite the mountain of evidence against him, he stuck to his story, denying everything. But the jury didn't need long to deliberate. They unanimously found him guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving at least 20 years. Soon after his sentencing, Stewart tried to appeal the verdict, claiming that the high-profile nature of the case had biased the jury, preventing him from receiving a fair trial. However, the appeals court rejected his claims. In February 2006, Stewart made another attempt to have his sentence reviewed, but once again, his appeal was denied. 10 years later, in February 2016, Stewart became eligible for parole, but his request was denied. The reason was clear. Even after spending 2 decades in prison, he still refused to admit to the crime and maintained his innocence. The judge also expressed concerns that Stewart continues to pose a threat to society. At present, he remains incarcerated, with little possibility of release in the near future. It is worth noting that Stewart was ultimately ruled out as a suspect in the other murders previously mentioned. Those crimes were later attributed to a different truck driver, who was apprehended in late 1997. Although prosecutors officially linked him to only 2 murders, they suspect he may be responsible for several other unsolved cases. Regarding Stewart, investigators also theorized that Celine might not have been his only victim. However, despite the passage of time, no concrete evidence has surfaced to tie him to any additional crimes. Feel free to share your thoughts on this case in the comments section. Moving on to the next case. The Chun family tragedy. On the afternoon of October 8, 2014, a co-worker of 39-year-old Jean Jifeng grew worried when the father of 2 failed to show up for his scheduled shift at King's Walk, a restaurant where he worked. He hadn't called in sick either, which was unusual. Concerned, the co-worker decided to check on Chan at his home on Western Avenue in the Guilderland suburb of Albany, New York. What he discovered inside was a horrific crime scene. Chan and his 38-year-old wife, Hai Yilin, were originally from Huaiyu, China. The couple had moved to the United States in the early 2000s, settling in Guilderland near a takeout restaurant owned by relatives. There, they built a life together and had 2 children, 10-year-old Anthony and 7-year-old Eddie. By all accounts, the Chin family was ordinary, with nothing unusual about their lives, making their brutal murders all the more puzzling to investigators. The case gained significant attention, as it was the first quadruple homicide in the Capital District. According to Chen's brother, who spoke to the media, the father of 2 was found on the ground floor of the family's bungalow. Hai and the couple's 2 children were discovered upstairs, their bodies covered by a blanket. The family had met a brutal end. Each of them had been bludgeoned with a hammer, and later reports indicated they had also been stabbed. Investigators determined the murders took place in the early morning hours, likely between 3:30 and 6:30 a.m. Both the Guilderland and New York State Police worked together on the case, searching the areas surrounding the family's home for any possible clues. Authorities faced several challenges in the initial 48 hours of the investigation. A language barrier slowed progress, and fear within the community made gathering information difficult. Further complicating matters, there were no surveillance cameras in the area, and Apple initially refused to release the Chen's iPhone records. Though the company eventually complied, law enforcement stated that the delays significantly hindered their investigation. With little physical evidence recovered from the crime scene, detectives have struggled to make progress. Some DNA samples were collected and may belong to a suspect, but so far, no matches have been found. As a result, authorities have few leads and no major suspects in the case. Before long, allegations surfaced that the family were involved in shady business practices and illegal activities such as human trafficking, gambling, and money laundering. Chen's brother denied rumors that the family had been attacked by someone who'd returned to the house after a gambling party to steal their sizable take from the been living comfortably ever since, causing people to think that he was making money illegally. This same source alleged that Hai was in the country illegally too. Meanwhile, an article by the Times-Union reported that Chan had supposedly been involved in large transfers of unrecorded cash, which he used to pay undocumented Chinese workers at restaurants in New York City. He reportedly also transported the workers to their jobs and back and provided accommodation in cities that were too far away for bus trips. Even more damningly, 18 mattresses were found on the basement floor of the family's home. The Times-Union also claimed that the weekly card game Chin ran had racked up about $100,000 in debt. However, this is where that lead dries up. Authorities have said that while the organized crime theory hasn't been discounted, they have yet to find any solid leads in the case. The only other theory explored in the case was a possible connection between the Chin family murders and 2 other family killings that occurred around the same time. In 2014, a family of 4 was shot and killed in their Houston, Texas home. Similarly, in 2011, a married couple and the wife's sister were found stabbed to death in their Mississippi residence. However, no definitive links have been established between these crimes. By 2015, investigators had pursued 600 leads, a surprisingly low number for such a serious case. A reporter from World Journal suggested that she and her colleagues suspected the family may have known more than they disclosed. The Chan's funeral took place a month after their deaths to allow time for relatives from overseas to attend. They were laid to rest at All Faith Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens. The case remains unsolved, and a $5,000 reward is still being offered for information leading to an arrest. Anyone with knowledge of the Chin family murders is encouraged to report it at capitalregionalcrimestoppers.com. https://capitalregionalcrimestoppers.com. Moving on to the next case.